The sheets beneath you are softer than clouds, smooth silk wrapping you in comfort, unlike anything you've ever known. Light drifts gently across walls studded with shimmering stones, each one glowing like a star trapped in crystal. The air carries the faint sweetness of jasmine and rosewater, and attendants in flowing golden robes move quietly nearby, waiting with serene patience for your word. For a moment, it feels as though you've awakened in a dream, a paradise where you've been chosen to live as a goddess, surrounded by beauty and privilege beyond imagination. Yet as you take your first steps into this gilded world, a subtle unease lingers. The women around you smile, but their movements are tense, their eyes flickering toward unseen corners. Whispers float through the air, and you notice faint scars etched across the hands and arms of some who have been here longer. Beneath the sweetness of flowers, another scent drifts, a bitter undertone that unsettles your heart. Behind the jeweled walls and silk curtains lies a place far removed from the paradise it pretends to be. Here, beauty is a form of currency, silence a weapon, and survival a quiet art. What appears to be a world of comfort and splendor hides rules and rituals so strange, so demanding, that they would slowly bend the spirit until little remained but obedience. Imagine for a moment life in ancient China, when imperial power reached into every home. One day, the stillness of your family life is broken by the arrival of guards at your door. They do not come for taxes, nor to deliver a message. They come to see you, to judge whether your beauty fits the standards of the empire. You are not treated as a daughter or sister, but as something to be measured, examined, and possibly taken away. The selection of Xiunu, literally beautiful girls, was no gentle process. Young women were inspected as though they were items in a market. They stood before strangers who studied every feature, examined their teeth, and tested the flexibility of their limbs. Each movement was recorded, each flaw noted, every detail weighed as if deciding the worth of an object, not a life. For those who passed, the trials did not end. There were lessons in posture, in silence, in manners so precise that every bite of food was measured against impossible ideals. Hours were spent in observation, judges watching with quiet intensity, searching for signs of resistance, independence, or will. It was never enough to be beautiful. The system sought something else. Women not only graceful in form, but softened in spirit, their individuality quietly pressed away. In that stillness, in that controlled calm, the empire found what it desired most, not companions, but perfect ornaments, each trained to serve, and never to dream of freedom. The women who managed to endure the grueling examinations, the endless inspections, and the quiet tests of patience were said to have achieved what the empire called a once-in-a-lifetime honor. They were invited into the inner sanctum of the imperial palace, chosen to become companions to the most powerful man in the realm. Yet this honor was not a gift of freedom or joy. It was, in truth, the end of their individuality. From that moment onward, their lives no longer belonged to them. Every step, every word, every breath they took became part of a system that valued them not as people, but as ornaments, delicate pieces of a vast machine whose purpose was to please and sustain one man. To be selected was to cross a threshold into a world where a woman's very body, her spirit, and even her most private emotions were transformed into the property of the state. The Empire of China believed with great seriousness that the vitality of the entire kingdom depended on the balance and harmony of the emperor's private life. His health, his vigor, and even his moments of desire were treated as matters of national importance. Imagine the weight of that belief, that the well-being of millions was thought to rest upon the satisfaction of a single man. To ensure this balance, the palace constructed a system of startling complexity. Bureaucrats, secretaries, and attendants were all tasked with organizing what should have been the most intimate of human experiences. The emperor's nights were not left to chance or preference. They were mapped out with the same precision used in military campaigns. Concubines were rotated in a strict sequence, each woman allotted her moment of proximity, no more and no less than the order dictated. There were scribes, whose duty it was to record every encounter, With brushes dipped in red vermilion, they created meticulous records of the emperor's private hours. These documents were not whispers of romance or fragments of poetry, but official reports, each one noting who had entered the emperor's chambers, when, and under what circumstances. It was a ledger of intimacy, reducing passion to nothing more than inventory. Even the calendars of the palace revealed the priorities of this system. Where ordinary families might track harvests or holidays, within the Forbidden City, dates were marked to govern the emperor's schedule of desire. Days and nights were carefully arranged to ensure fairness among the concubines, to preserve order, and to guarantee that the emperor's vitality was properly distributed. Now imagine, for just a moment, what it meant to live inside such a system. Your most private moments were no longer yours to decide. They were written in ink by unseen hands, planned days or weeks in advance. The act of love, which for most people is a matter of choice, of spontaneity, was transformed into something as impersonal as a business meeting. The palace was a place where silence was demanded, where individuality had to be hidden, and where a woman's body was scheduled by decree. And yet, for all its precision, this Chinese system was not the most extreme the world had known. In time, across continents, another empire would rise, one whose approach to imperial intimacy would make the Chinese system appear almost restrained. In the Ottoman Empire, the concept of the harem became something even more elaborate, more carefully designed, and infinitely more competitive. The harem of the sultans was not merely a residence for women, it was a hierarchy, a ladder built entirely upon the foundation of intimacy. Within its walls, a woman's status, her comfort, and even her survival were tied to her relationship with the sovereign. A single night with the sultan could transform a life forever. If chosen, a woman was no longer just another slave girl. She would be granted her own chambers, her own servants, and an allowance. She would receive recognition and privileges that set her apart from others who remained waiting in obscurity. Her proximity to the Sultan was not simply a matter of affection, it was the currency by which she secured her future. The system was not about romance or companionship, it was about structure and control. Intimacy itself became a kind of coin, traded and spent to gain influence. A woman's ability to capture the attention of the Sultan could elevate her to a position of wealth and authority, but failure could mean isolation or worse. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried with it the weight of survival. In this intricate web, records were once again of the utmost importance. The chief treasurer of the harem, known as the Hazendar, kept a diary more precise than any love story. Within its pages were notes of each encounter, recorded not for sentiment but for certainty, establishing which children were legitimate heirs and which moments of passion would shape the politics of the empire. Even pregnancy was logged as though it were a financial transaction. The dates, the circumstances, the outcomes. Nothing was left to memory or mystery. The very architecture of the Ottoman harem reflected this structure. At the Palace of Topkapi, chambers were arranged in a way that silently echoed the hierarchy of intimacy. The Sultan's favoured women were placed closest to his rooms, enjoying luxuries of food, clothing, and attention. Those further away, whose favour had dwindled, lived in more modest quarters, their distance from the sovereign a quiet reminder of their declining importance. In these walls, physical space itself told the story of power and vulnerability. Life inside the harem was not simply comfortable or oppressive, it was both, at once. On one hand, women of influence could wield extraordinary power, shaping politics through whispered counsel or the raising of future heirs. On the other, every breath of that power was precarious, granted only at the pleasure of the Sultan. At any moment, favour could vanish, and when favour vanished, safety often vanished with it. The nights of the Sultan were shared among many, rotated in careful patterns to prevent disputes. But disputes could never truly be avoided. When survival depended on intimacy, rivalry was inevitable. Women competed fiercely for moments in the Sultan's presence, knowing that a single evening could change the course of their lives. The schedule, intended to bring fairness, only heightened the pressure, creating a cycle of longing and dread as each woman counted down the days until her turn arrived, or passed her by. Even the way concubines were presented to the Sultan was stripped of humanity. Eunuchs would bring forth wooden tablets, each bearing a name. To flip a tablet was to summon a woman, reducing her existence to a marker chosen at a glance. When the emperor made his choice, the selected woman was prepared with ritual care. She was bathed, perfumed, and wrapped in fine cloth, not as a person, but as though she were a rare gift being delivered. Carried through the silent corridors of the palace, she would be brought into the Sultan's presence, her fate sealed for that night, and perhaps for the rest of her life. Within these jeweled halls, intimacy became theatre, survival became a performance, and love, if it could be called that, was drowned beneath the weight of politics, hierarchy, and power. For the women who lived within the harem, every moment was both privilege and prison, a place where beauty shone brightly, but freedom was but a distant memory. The women chosen to enter the emperor's chambers did so under a ritual that was as cold as it was humiliating. Before they could step into the room, they were stripped of their clothing, not for intimacy, but for inspection. Nakedness here was not vulnerability shared between two people. It was surveillance, a way to ensure no hidden blade or weapon could threaten the emperor. What should have been moments of closeness became procedures of control, turning women into suspects, their bodies searched and cleared like prisoners before a warden. Among the many strange customs of imperial power, perhaps none were more unsettling than those of Emperor Wu of Jin. History tells us he filled his harem with thousands upon thousands of women, pulling daughters from homes, particularly the children of his own officials, to swell his collection. No one could marry until he was satisfied that his choices had been made, holding the fate of families and futures hostage to his whims. By the height of his reign, more than 10,000 women were confined to this gilded prison, each one reduced to a number in his vast collection. Faced with such overwhelming abundance, the emperor devised a method of choosing his nightly companion that seems almost absurd in its cruelty. Rather than exercise personal judgment, Emperor Wu rode in a cart pulled by goats. Wherever the goats stopped, whichever woman's chamber they happened to pause at, that was the one chosen for the night. The fate of a human being was left to the idle wandering of animals. For the women, this meant living in limbo, their futures tethered not even to the emperor's will, but to the path of barnyard creatures. Imagine waiting in silence, not knowing whether the clatter of hooves in the corridor would stop at your door. To be summoned was not a gift of love, but a reminder that their lives were no longer their own. To be passed over was equally cruel, leaving them to exist as little more than forgotten ornaments, dust gathering on beauty that was never seen. This strange system revealed a deeper truth. Within these palaces, intimacy was not the meeting of two human beings. It was chance, ritual, and control. Women were reduced to objects, their lives shaped not by choice, but by the randomness of where an animal paused its steps. And yet, even as strange as this practice was, it mirrored the wider reality of imperial harems across history. In the Ottoman court, the stakes were even higher, and the atmosphere far more dangerous. Here, competition was not only about attention or favour, it was about survival itself. Every smile, every sip of sherbet, every whispered word carried the weight of suspicion. Women lived in a state of perpetual fear, knowing that rivals could strike at any moment. Poisoning was a constant threat, a silent weapon slipped into food or drink. The warmth of a friendship could turn in an instant, for alliances were fragile, and betrayal was often the only path to advancement. Violence was not rare, it was woven into the fabric of life within the harem. Mahidevran Sultan, consumed by jealousy, scarred Roxolana's face in an outburst meant to strip away her beauty and weaken her hold over the Sultan. Another, Gulshah Sultan, drove a rival over a cliff, disguising murder as misfortune. Hurrem Sultan, powerful, influential, feared, met her end in strangulation, undone by those who could no longer tolerate her reach into matters of state. Others, like Bezem Sultan, simply vanished, their disappearances leaving behind only whispers and warnings. Each act of violence was not simply personal anger, it was strategy, a calculated move in an unspoken war where beauty and influence were weapons, and survival demanded cunning as sharp as any blade. The harem was a place where rivalry burned constantly beneath the surface, where women measured their chances with the precision of soldiers on a battlefield. This tension rippled beyond the palace walls. The fear, jealousy, and constant maneuvering that defined the lives of the women seeped into politics, shaping decisions that touched entire nations. Personal rivalries influenced alliances, treaties, even wars. What happened in those shadowed chambers, what whispered plots and hidden daggers decided, could alter the fate of an empire. Inside, though, it was not the grandeur of palaces or the sparkle of jewels that defined life. It was the silence of waiting, the sharpness of suspicion, and the dread that every kindness might hide an enemy's hand. For those who lived within the harem, every day was both privilege and peril, a life spent balancing on the edge of fear, where survival meant seeing through masks and finding strength in shadows. The cruelty of the imperial system in China could be as chilling as anything the Ottoman palaces endured. Records speak of Emperor Shizong in the 16th century, whose suspicion and paranoia turned the harem into a place of constant fear. More than 200 women were executed under his command. Their crimes were not treason or betrayal, but offences so slight they seem almost unthinkable. A voice raised too loud, a robe chosen in the wrong shade of silk. The palace, meant to be a place of elegance, became a chamber of dread, where death could arrive for the smallest misstep. And yet, within this atmosphere of terror, not every concubine accepted her fate in silence. In one of history's most desperate acts of rebellion, 16 women conspired together against the emperor himself. Imagine the moment. Women who had been stripped of their freedom, their dignity, their very sense of self, coming together in the secrecy of night. They had no swords, no armor, no weapons of war. Instead, they clutched the objects closest to them: hairpins, scarves, bedding, ordinary things that became their only tools of resistance. When they entered the emperor's chamber, it was with the resolve of people who no longer feared death. They wound a silken scarf around his throat, pressed hairpins toward his flesh, each movement carrying the weight of years of silence and despair. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. In the struggle, the emperor lost an eye, but fate did not favor them. His empress arrived just in time, saving his life and condemning theirs. The punishment was almost beyond imagination. The women were torn apart limb by limb, alive, their cries carrying through the palace corridors, echoing as warnings to any who might dare to follow their path. Their severed heads were displayed on poles within the harem itself, turning the place of silken curtains and jeweled walls into a gallery of terror. Every glance at those lifeless faces was a reminder. Resistance would be met not with freedom, but with unimaginable cruelty. Even as these horrors unfolded, the empire continued to document them with a bureaucrat's precision. The same system that recorded intimate encounter. Horrors and the rotations of concubines also noted rebellions and executions. A chilling efficiency reduced moments of human anguish to lines of ink in a ledger. There exists an account of one wife of Sultan Suleiman, executed not for defiance or treachery, but for selling her turn with the Sultan to another woman, as though her own body were a commodity to be traded. This was more than the story of sex. It was the complete transformation of intimacy into property, something that could be bought, sold, exchanged, or stolen. To see such transactions entered into official records shows the depth of this dehumanization. Love, desire, tenderness, all dissolved into paperwork, as if even the most private connections of the human heart were nothing more than resources to be managed. The harm of these systems stretched far beyond palace walls. When emperors and sultans treated women as possessions, it sent a message to every corner of their realms. Women were not equals, but objects, meant to serve and to be discarded. What happened in gilded halls trickled into villages and cities, shaping how entire societies understood the worth of women. Abuse became normalized, written into the very fabric of culture. To maintain these practices, rulers cloaked them in the language of necessity. In the Ottoman world, the harem was said to guard virtue, to prevent adultery, by confining sexuality within a controlled system. In China, the organization of the emperor's private life was presented as a way to preserve cosmic order itself. ensuring harmony between heaven and earth, guaranteeing the prosperity of all. But behind these justifications lay a harsher truth. These systems existed not for purity, not for balance, not for cosmic order, but for the pleasure of powerful men who had convinced themselves that their desires outweighed the dignity of thousands of women. The palaces glittered with jewels, the ceremonies unfolded with grandeur, the silks shimmered in the light, but all of it was decoration, a mask to hide the machinery of exploitation. Beneath the splendor, what endured was suffering, what endured was control. The harem was never a paradise. It was a place where beauty itself was weaponized, where tenderness was stripped away and replaced with protocols, ledgers, and fear. It was a prison gilded in gold, designed not to honor love, but to cage it. The Imperial Harem was not simply a place of luxury, as the polished stories of palaces might suggest. It was, in truth, one of the most enduring experiments in stripping away human dignity. For centuries, empires that commanded armies and ruled vast lands poured immense effort into building institutions whose single purpose was to transform women into objects of beauty, of desire, of control. And yet, these same institutions wrapped themselves in ceremony and grandeur, convincing all who looked upon them that what happened inside was not exploitation, but order, even nobility. For the women who lived through these systems, survival came at a terrible cost. Their bodies may have endured, but their spirits carried wounds that no eye could see. They learned to exist in a world where intimacy was not warmth, but struggle. Beauty became not a gift, but a blade, one that cut both others and themselves. Trust was rare, affection rarer still. In a place where every glance could hide a rival's scheme, and every gesture was measured against the favor of a single man, the very idea of love was a memory too fragile to hold. Some found release only in death. For them, the end came as a quiet escape from a life that offered no freedom, no chance of tenderness. Others lived on, long enough to see the cycle continue. They watched as younger women were brought into the same walls, eating the same rituals, walking the same path of fear and hope that they had once walked, knowing the truth. They could do nothing but witness the same suffering begin anew. It is tempting to think of these stories as distant, as myths or exaggerations told by time, but they were not. They were real systems, vast and carefully maintained, that shaped the lives of millions across generations. The palaces may now stand as ruins or museums, their silk curtains long gone, their jeweled halls quiet. Yet the patterns that sustained them, the ways power can warp intimacy, the ways desire can be twisted into control, still echo into the present. The strange and often grotesque customs of the Imperial Harem were not simply curiosities of history. They were the natural endpoint of societies that placed male authority above all else, that considered a woman's will expendable in the service of politics and order. These systems survived because entire civilizations accepted the illusion that sexual slavery was not only permissible, but necessary for the stability of the world. Behind every glittering surface lay the same truth. These were prisons disguised as palaces. Beauty here was not celebrated, but chained. Sexuality was not connection, but a weapon, wielded in battles no one could truly win.